Welcome to our next class in topic 3 of biodiversity and conservation. Today we are going to talk about threats to biodiversity. So we'll cover a little bit of information about current diversity numbers in the world, how many species there are, some things that threaten those species, and some conservation efforts that are underway. Let's get started. First, some questions. From an ethical point of view, considering your environmental value system, does it matter if a species goes extinct? What value do these species have to us? What science involves killing organisms for a greater good, and are there limits that we should not go beyond? And this last question about de-extinction efforts, I think is especially interesting right now. This is something that's happening. They're starting to recover DNA from extinct species and think that they could recreate them in a lab. Is that something that's important to consider? Is that something that ethically humans should be involved in doing? There's a lot of interesting questions when you consider this idea of threats to biodiversity and what's important and what's not. In order to properly understand threats to biodiversity, it's important to understand total world biodiversity as it stands right now. And as it stands right now, we don't have a very good estimate of how many species there are in the planet. The estimates for numbers of species on the planet range from 2 to 100 million, and this is excluding bacteria. This is only other kingdoms of life. About 2 million of them are currently named, and as we're discovering species, we catalog them as fast as possible, but the estimates for how many species we have left to discover range really drastically. In this table, we're going to do some percent calculations, because that is something you need to know how to do on your IB exams, and it's just a good thing to do a refresher on. So if you were given a table like this, where you know that in the group of insects, there have been 84,000 species found, but it is estimated that there are 8 million species of insect, and you are asked what percent we have already identified, that math is pretty simple. You do 84,000 divided by 8 million, and then multiply that answer by 100. 8, I'm just going to do to the 6th, and then that's supposed to be an exponent, and the answer that you would get is 11%. So you should make sure for your IB exams you know how to calculate percentage values. Take a minute to try to do the percentages for algae and for fungi as well. For algae, with 15,000 species found out of a possible 500,000, you should get 3% of species that have been identified. And for fungi, with 70,000 species found out of a possible 1,000,000, this number's a lot higher. You should get about 70% of these species that have been identified. So just a quick math review before we move on to talk a little bit more about the content of species biodiversity threats and what causes that and what we can do. So first, let's talk about some things that can maintain biodiversity. There's 3 main factors you should be familiar with. The first is complexity, because complexity of an ecosystem increases its resilience, its ability to resist change. The second is an advanced stage of succession. Remember, we talked about the stages of succession in topic 2. The more advanced an ecosystem is in its succession, the more complex it is. So this feeds back into number 1. And the third is the resources that are available. And if you have a lot of water, light, heat, and nutrients available in an ecosystem, it is going to be easier to maintain diversity. A good example of that is the rainforest ecosystem, has all of those things, and rainforests, as we've talked a little bit about, have the highest biodiversity numbers for the whole planet. So now that we understand some of the things that maintain biodiversity, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that take it away, the factors that lead to a loss of biodiversity. And there are some big ones that you should know. The first is fragmentation. So that means when you're breaking up a habitat, that leads to loss of biodiversity because it's difficult for species to cope with their habitat being interrupted. The second is natural hazards, weather events, natural disasters. Like we talked about in the last lesson, natural hazards are one of the things that has caused mass extinction events in the past, so this is a big one. The third is pollution. That's another thing that disrupts an ecosystem. It causes big changes in the abiotic factors that are present in an ecosystem. So pollution leads to loss of biodiversity. The fourth is overexploitation, and this can be through loss of habitat like deforestation that we see up here, or through things like hunting. Overexploitation is really always created by human populations, and it has a big effect on biodiversity in ecosystems. The fifth is invasive species. In the example of the dodo bird going extinct, that was the fault of an invasive species, so this comes up a lot. The sixth is disease, because that reduces the genetic diversity. And remember, that's one of our components of biodiversity. And the seventh is agriculture, because when we undergo commercial agriculture efforts, we manipulate species and artificially reduce biodiversity in order to grow more food. So this is a question that comes up not infrequently on the IB exams, is to discuss some factors that lead to a loss of biodiversity, and these are good ones to be familiar with. Next, let's talk a little bit about the most vulnerable ecosystems. Because tropical rainforests are so diverse, they contain 50% of all known species on the planet. They contain 6% of land area, so in not a very large amount of land, there's a huge amount of species. They are very vulnerable to loss in biodiversity. As we go in and do things like, from our last slide, overexploit the different environments that are there and use that land for agriculture, we see a loss of biodiversity happening in tropical rainforests really, really quickly. We are clearing out trees in the rainforest at a rate of 1.5 hectares per second. So when you consider the biodiversity of different ecosystems, it's important to keep tropical rainforests in mind. And we'll talk a little bit in the next slide about some of the things that make those species in tropical rainforests prone to extinction. So some of those species are endemic. They only live in one place, and that means that if something happens in that one place that they live, endemic, if something happens in that place that they live, they go extinct. They've died out. Also, some of those species have a small population. Some of them, like the large mammals, have a large body. That means that it's harder to move and to hide from overexploitation efforts. You don't see this as much in tropical rainforests, but the idea of seasonal migration also makes species prone to extinction because you need more resources. You need resources in two places, and you also need resources along the way of your migrational journey. So that is a difficult set of circumstances to meet, and that makes a species more prone to extinction. The next is a specialized niche. We talked about a niche as the specific set of conditions that an organism needs in order to survive. The more specialized those conditions are, the harder it is to stay alive. And the last, and this is a big one, is species that are of interest to humans. We kill things really fast. We love to kill things. When things are beautiful or interesting, we celebrate that by killing them. So when humans take notice of a species and have some resource or cultural use for it, that almost immediately puts its population at risk. Luckily, we have some things in place now to deal with at-risk populations. And one of those things is the IUCN Red List. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. It's part of the UN. And they maintain this list of different classifications of species. It goes all the way from least concern, so animals and plants that we really don't have to worry about, to animals and plants that are already extinct. And they're working to try to catalog all of the species that we know about in order to focus conservation efforts. And that is an important job. and something that we'll talk a little bit more about in the homework questions. So for now, let's keep going and look at an example of a currently endangered species. Because remember, this idea of using specific examples comes up a lot in IB exams. So if you were asked about an endangered animal, you could talk about the Asian elephant. They're endangered due to habitat loss and illegal wildlife trade. So they're of interest to human beings, and where they live is of interest to human beings. There are currently only about 40,000 Asian elephants left in the wild. Some of the things that are being done to protect them are wildlife patrol units and better conservation efforts. And we'll talk a little bit more about the idea of what specifically those conservation efforts could mean in the next lesson. But for now, let's move on to the homework. For homework, if you're following along in the textbook, read pages 163 to 179. And also try these questions. There are 3 IB style questions I'd like you to try. The first is using specific examples, so talking about specific animals and specific places, outline factors which have led to recent animal extinctions. The second is describe a specific named species that is endangered and the efforts that have been made to save the species from extinction. And the last is to evaluate, so remember that's benefits and drawbacks, the effectiveness of the IUCN Red List. So give those questions a try. When you are ready, move on to the review video and we will go over the responses. See you there.